I don't know whether it's possible to cultivate a style.
Nobody is precisely what they think they are. Love is where you find it, where you find it, where you find it. Love is where you find it.
Maybe in the last moments of my life, I will be curious to know what it means to die.
Welcome to Folk Phenomenology. My name is Sam Rocha. This is episode 2 of season 1, featuring special guest Jeannie Gaffigan on the Tragicomic. Today's episode was originally recorded on March 2nd, 2021. Folk Phenomenology is sponsored by Whip and Stock Publishers, who published my 2015 book that this podcast takes as its namesake, Folk Phenomenology, Education, Study, and the Human Person. Give Us This Day, Daily Prayer for Today's Catholic. The Institute for Christian Socialism, Building a Movement of the Ecumenical Christian Left. Solidarity Hall, Eden, plus Utopia. Revelation Cable Company, Vancouver Custom Cables and Pedalboard Solutions. Black Catholic Messenger, an online publication for Black Catholics. The Juan Diego Network, Catholic audio for Latinos, and Commonweal Magazine, the leading lay Catholic voice for commentary on religion, politics, and culture. The featured sponsor for today's episode is Where Peter Is. Where Peter Is, and in particular their founder, Mike Lewis, are the ones who introduced me via Twitter to Jeannie Gaffigan. I don't know exactly, and I don't recall the particular details of that interaction, but I do know that my introduction to Jeannie was through or within or because of Where Peter Is. Where Peter is a fantastic website. It's just wherepeteris.com that is committed to defending the papacy of Pope Francis against its critics. In case you haven't heard, the age-old joke, is the Pope Catholic, has recently lost its punchline. And this odd, but nonetheless, for Roman Catholics, somewhat scandalous situation, in particular within the United States, is the one that Where Peter Is was built to respond to. And so I'm very happy to have them as a sponsor for the show, and I'm very, very happy to also support them. There was a time when I was the editor of Patheos Catholic that I in fact passed on an early iteration of the idea that became Where Peter Is, and Mike likes to give me a hard time about that, and for good reason, but I'm very happy now that we're working together, and I'm especially happy and grateful for the connection that was made to Jeannie, who you'll hear me in dialogue with today. If you would like to support Folk Phenomenology, please share this episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite app or platform, and maybe even leave us a review or a rating. You can also drop a tip into the tip jar. The interview you're about to hear is the very first thing that I recorded for this show. Jeannie was very generous from the very beginning whenever I conceived of this project, and she's been so supportive of other projects of mine. But in this one in particular, we had a brief conversation beforehand where we talked a bit about some ideas, and I had a sense of direction for the interview. But then whenever the time came to record, I was a full hour late because I made a mistake in my time zone conversions. So I arrived fairly frazzled, and Jeannie had a very small window of time to fit me in, and we took off, and a lot of the notes I had taken from our conversation to sort of set up the interview really no longer seemed to apply, and I'm so grateful for that, because what came out of it and what bloomed from that was an entry into this difficult place of divine comedy, of the tragicomic, of the wit involved in an idea like the motto for the show, Dilexit Mundum.
Hello.
Hi, Jeannie.
Hi, Sam.
I want to talk about your book, When Life Gives You Pears, but I really would like to maybe back up behind the book, because the book is autobiographical, right?
Yes.
And so in some sense, I guess, talking about the book and talking about your life is the same conversation, so to speak. I read your book. Actually, I read your book after my wife read your book, and I kind of heard this prequel to your book in as my wife talked about it, and then I finally got to read it myself. And my reading of it was as a redemption story. I'd like to know, though, a little bit about the prequel to the book, in the sense of a little bit more about your life and a little bit more about the book and the context of what brought the book into being. And then maybe we can go from there into whether or not my particular reading of your book as a story of redemption makes sense or fits. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I mean, I have to tell you that the prequel story of like how the book came to be is, sort of not, it's kind of in the book, right? But if you specifically want to know like where I was at, like mentally, or I'm just be more specific what you're saying in terms of like my life before the book.
Yeah, so like there's a lot of things to me that bring us in some ways into the book, because your book biographically goes quite a ways back into your youth and coming to New York and stuff. But I guess I'm more interested in the life story that's not necessarily inside the book, but that sort of animates the book. In particular, the kind of, I'm trying to get into the folds of like the motivations and desires and impulses that brought you to the point of saying, you know what, I think I want to write a book or create a book.
Okay, so there's kind of like a funny story about the way that the book came to be, that has a lot to do with what my problems are as what my pitfalls are as a human, like what my kind of thorn is that I deal with all the time. So I am a very high achiever. Like, I don't know where it came from. I've always been like that. And I don't know if it's some kind of competition thing, or if it's just kind of like, people say like, oh, you have a type A personality, like you're just born that way, right? You come out, and you start like taking everything out of the cupboards when you're a toddler, and then there's the kid that kind of just sits there and is docile, and I was the one who like dismantled everything. So meanwhile, prior to me getting sick, which is what kind of compelled me to write this story, I was just at a point where I had been the executive producer of an autobiographical television show, working at least 80 hours a week on that, and simultaneously trying to like hold my family, my large family of 5 children together. And because the show that I wrote with my husband was about our family, I felt like I was still kind of connected with being like a mother and wife, but it came to pass that I started to have these really like strong feelings about how I was being honest, right? Because a lot of what I feel comedy is it's honesty. And so at a certain point, I looked kind of ahead and I thought, if I'm writing autobiographical stories about my family, am I writing all in the past? Because at this point, I'm not experiencing my family on this level anymore, because I'm working away from my kids all the time. And the relationship that I have with my husband, although it's always been focused on, how to balance work, and we started working together before we even got engaged. So work has always been an important bond that we have. And I even say this in the book, is that I'm not sure if I had wound up with somebody else, that it would have worked as well, because there was always this other thing of work that was like the other woman or the other man. It was like the work. So when you work together, it's like he's kind of like that too. So we had he and I, and then we had the work that we were both contributing to, and that's a really important part of our relationship. So anyway, I don't have to give all the details, but essentially we decided not to do the next season of the show, and to kind of end on a high note and move on to other things. So what happened was, and what I realized a lot later on in my recovery from my surgery, that when I started writing the book, is that I just kind of lost touch with how to be in touch with my family, how to be connected to the physical and emotional and spiritual world. And I had all of a sudden this hole that was about the work that I was doing, that needed to be filled by something like work. So I went kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, and I started working I just moved my location. I was now in an office in my home, but I was still the executive producer of the Gaffigan family. I kind of pivoted. So I started taking on all these other projects, feeling free, because I felt kind of like I was trapped in this work environment. Even though I loved it, it was not allowing me to be, free to be, a real person, right? When you're writing about yourself as a real person, there's this weird disconnect all of a sudden that happens where you're like, wait, am I writing reality now? Because I'm not actually having the experiences with my actual children that compelled me to write this story. So it's almost like I got into this weird trap. And when I was out of that obligation, I just filled it with other obligations. And so I lost touch with it. So I know this is a very esoteric type.
No, I relate to this almost too much, you could say. I mean, I think there's a kind of road being paved here, just to not to not make you feel like this is you're the only one on the spot. Over the last 8 years, I recently tweeted about this. My progress into the academy, especially my PhD, which I did in 3 years, which was like a flash. I didn't really know what was ahead of me, but I was thrown into the academic job market. Since I'm not the product of a particularly academic or pedigreed background or family, everything was new and everything was learning on the fly. And by the time I reached my first tenure track position, my work essentially had really, I'd kind of almost lost my family in almost, you could say, like a literal way. And so my first reform was that I can't just change. I can't just well, for one, I can't stop the work. It's our daily bread and other things. So I said, right. But I said, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stay home a lot and do a lot of my work at home, even obstinately work at home. And for a long time, all I did to change my life was to just be at home a lot, which actually in some sense made our lives harder because I didn't know how to be at home. I didn't know how to be a member of the family, really. And it's only been recently, that now 8 years later, that I've been finally realizing that, you know what, just being around all the time isn't actually value added necessarily. You got to do things and move from quantity to quality. You got to move from, just time clocked in on the premises to actual quality time and stuff like that. So no, what you said there, it really hit me actually personally, in terms of I guess my attempt at a redemption story, which is still ongoing. I'm nowhere close. I don't know if you said it was esoteric. I said, no, I heard it this way. Do you hear it the way I'm hearing it?
Well, yeah. And I think that if I didn't feel like this kind of dynamic had value to a lot of people, I wouldn't, it would just be this personal thing, because I could very easily say, well, I'm so niche. I'm, married to a comedian. I have this very weird life, and I can't relate to anybody.
Well, let's talk about that though, because there's obviously that's kind of the elephant in the room, is that whenever, and I've actually seen it in people's responses, even look, I'm going to confess to you, I've gotten messages from, my sister of oh my gosh, you are totally talking to Jeannie Gaffigan on Twitter right now. That's crazy, right? And I know that's kind of it sounds strange, but it is a part of I think what I'm calling the elephant in the room, which is you do have an exceptional, in the sense of the exception, right? You have this different life, when you're talking about your work with your husband, it's Jim Gaffigan, who is to you my husband, my beloved, but to people on the other side of the sound, it's the whole celebrity thing. How do you think through that? Because, in some ways, I think as an academic, we feel, and I feel like this is a weird life, a different life, a bit avant-garde maybe, but I don't think I can even begin to fathom your side of that, right?
Well, I think that the reason that I brought it up as the elephant in the room is that I could easily just be well, nobody can relate to me. But I feel that there's this part of me that wants to, express that we are humans. Even if your thing is your PhD and my thing was a TV show, it creates this kind of way that we are dealing with our lives, that we can find truth in and we can find healing in, right? By that's what all these, if you are in, let's say, Alcoholics Anonymous, you're going into a room with a bunch of people who are completely different. One guy might be, divorced, or someone might be homeless, or someone might be, totally different. One might be rich, one might be poor, but we're all human. And that group has this special way of helping each other. And so by me bringing it up, I'm just saying I could have just said, well, literally nobody would be able to relate to any of these feelings, so I'm not going to tell my story. But at the same time, I'll get to how that figured into when I sat down and wrote a book, how that figured in later. But right now, what I'm saying is that I found things about myself that I feel like I've observed in other people. I've observed a lot in other women, and it doesn't mean, white women who, are exactly like me, who have 5 kids and married to a comedian who's famous. It's that's not the niche that I'm speaking to. I'm talking to, I'm trying to be as universal as I can. It's just that this is the way that it manifests in my life, and in your life it's different, but there's the same thing. So it's not only that I was physically, you're talking about, you made an effort, you had to make an effort to go, okay, I'm gonna go, shoot some baskets with my boy and be a dad, to be there for him. But if you're physically there, but you're oh my gosh, I'm thinking about this, thing, and let me just go check Twitter and all this stuff, that's a spiritual and emotional blockade that you might as well be at the office, or you might as well be away. So it's something that I didn't really realize after I left that job to experience my family more, I didn't make that other step, right? This is where I am right now before I start writing the book.
Right.
So basically, because I'm constantly saying yes to things that I don't have time for, which is another problem I have, I was in a situation where, because I had been, prior to the Jim Gaffigan show, I had been a much more behind the scenes producer. I was a producer, but I was producing comedy tours and I wasn't the one on stage, right? So in this way, one of the characters on the show, although she was portrayed by an actress, not me, was Jeannie Gaffigan. So Jeannie Gaffigan became a thing, right? So when the show ended, I had written 2 books as a story editor that were from Jim's point of view. That is Fat and Food, a Love Story. And both of them New York Times bestsellers, both of them funny, from a dad, you know, kind of that dark humor of the dad being like, you know, I wanted, but my happiest times with my kids are away from my kids. Like, that's kind of his tongue-in-cheek kind of.
So this is not your first book?
Well, it was the first book in my voice. So, but prior to that, I had worked with, you know, in the literary world. So I had a book agent, all this stuff. So, and this is like a good friend of mine. So anyway, he started talking about a book, and whether it was going to be another Jeannie and Jim book, or maybe, you know, a balanced, not Jim book, but like a Jeannie and Jim book. So anyway, I had this concept, because one of the things that was very present all the time is people would say, okay, now they knew I was a hands-on mom, that I didn't have, like, you know, everyone else doing things, and that I was, you know, schlepping my kids all over the universe. So I have this I was brought up in a very practical, like, you know, I think recently you did a Twitter post about what was the first time on a plane.
Yeah.
And, you know, I realized, like, I really didn't go anywhere until I was like 30. I didn't go anywhere. I mean, I went to Florida in a car, you know, it was, my grandparents lived there. We would drive all night. I mean, it was like in a big van with 9 kids. It was a very different life than me, you know, being, you know, this kind of, you know, world traveler. But anyway, but when I would go, I would have to pack 5 kids, right? And people are like, how? And then so I was like, I have this whole way, because I also struggle with, like, attention deficit disorder, which is undiagnosed in me. But now that I have a couple kids that have diagnosed ADHD, I recognize, oh, that's what was wrong with me when I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
So I, for myself, you know, to get through life and to get through school, I had to find ways to navigate my attention problem or my hyperactivity problem. So I have this whole system of doing things, and it was kind of inspirational to some other mothers of big families and, you know, people who were a little overwhelmed by organizing. So I started to write this book that we never got a title for it, because that's coming up in what I'm telling you, is I called it the Laundry Room Book, because I believe that the laundry room, even if it's a closet where you sort clothes, it's like the heart of the operations. It's like the command central, because that's where, I mean, it's this whole concept I have about how laundry, when you have a big family, can easily take over your life. It's like, but I mean, I know that you're an academic and you're probably like, what is she talking about? But it's like, this is, you know, I kind of broke down the whole laundry.
We have
thing.
laundry in our house too. Yeah.
You know, and like I related to like how it applies to like letting your emails pile up or your bills pile up. You know, it's a way to kind of look at something and say, okay, I'm going to divide and conquer, right? So this kind of concept I had for a book became like, what if it was like, I don't know if you've ever seen any of like Amy Sedaris. She's a comedian and an author. And she writes these books that are kind of like a cross between a coffee table book and a book, but there's a lot of graphics in them and there's a lot of pictures in them, and they're kind of like producing a movie. right?
Sure.
Because there's obviously a stylist, and there's wardrobe, and there's these different characters so she wrote a book about crafting, and she wrote a book about giving a party, and they're very funny. So I kind of saw it having a lot of graphics. Like, people love pictures and graphics
Sure.
in comedy books. So I'm working on this project. This is like one of the many things that I'm doing at this point in the book, where I kind of like start off when I go back, after I introduce what this book is going to be about. This is When Life Gives You Pears, the book that you're talking about. And this is where kind of the book starts. This is where I'm at. So this autobiographical little taste of only Sam is hearing this exact story that's happened.
Yes.
So meanwhile, all this stuff happens to me, which is in the book, where I, almost die. I am separated from my kids. I have like some of the most like physically agonizing experiences of my life. I have a vision of like what I believe to be hell. When it's like all these really dark things are happening to me. So jumping way ahead, I start to recover at home. Now I have machines at home. I have a nurse. I have, I'm like in a hospital, but I'm in my home, because at a certain point they're like, get her out of the hospital because she's just going to keep getting sicker with all these germs flying around.
Right.
So essentially people start, could you put me on the phone with your mom? Like, how I'm able to like croak out some words. And so Simon, who is my book agent, calls me as a friend, right?
Okay.
And they're like, Simon is on the phone. And I'm like, Simon. And so I start telling him I gotta get back to work on that book, right?
The laundry book.
The laundry room book. And he's like, Jeannie, there's no laundry room book right now. He's like, it's like the book. He's like, people, if you're gonna tell a story, what happened to you? What happened to you? What's going on? Like, no one knew what happened. They just, because we were very private until I came home. And then
I see.
Came home. So basically he posted it on Instagram that I was like a picture of me, Jeannie's home, thank God, or whatever, right? And there was the, IV and the machine, and everyone was like, what? So it started all these people calling and, everything like that. So, but because of who I am, and even after I went through all that stuff, I still was like, I gotta turn in my paper. You know what I mean? I was like, I can't, I still felt like I had to, I was on the clock,
Yeah.
And so he was kind of like, I was like almost argumentative. I was like, I know I'm going to do that. I got to get that done because I started it and I can't just abandon this project. And I was like, what if there's like a chapter about, then I had a brain tumor. Like, I was still trying to mold in the, trying to force that book to be done.
Yeah.
Because they had started it.
Sure.
And I'm so obsessive.
Yeah.
And so basically, when people, that's the funny story. And then I realized that I really didn't realize what happened because it happened so fast. It wasn't like when I was in it, I was just in the foxhole, right?
Yeah.
I was surviving.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have a lot of chance. So I had all these encounters with myself, with God, with Jim, and they were just these things that were happening. And I needed to, because I was traumatized.
Sure.
I needed to figure out what happened. And so as I recovered, I started to, make notes. Like, a lot of times, like if you feel like something bad is going to happen or you might die or whatever, a lot of people want to write down what's going on or they do a video interview of themselves and say, hey, to my baby son, I just got diagnosed with cancer or whatever.
Sure.
Like, what am I going to leave on this earth?
Mm-hmm.
So there was that motivation. And also, so it was for myself, the way that a lot of the book reads is kind of like a diary, right? This is me. I'm not Shakespeare. I'm not, trying to audition for anything. It's just like, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but this is what I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
So as I, and just to get back to what one of the things, just because I don't want to just go on and not address this, about the elephant in the room that you're talking about, like I have to be very aware that I am this person who is kind of, would never, no one probably would have cared if my husband was a comedian. Like no one would have wanted to read the book. I think people have crises all the time and want to write a book.
Sure.
And people and the agent's like, yeah, we have 16 brain tumor books on the, so I'm very blessed and lucky that I was able to tell my story and that's connected.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to address that.
Sure.
But at the same time, there are things that I went through that are just absolutely universal in terms of suffering. And it taught me things about myself and taught me things about the world that were really great lessons for me to sort of start a journey.
Mm-hmm.
So in no way do I want anyone who reads a book to think like, oh, she's got it all figured out. She's done. Well, good thing got that suffering over with. And now I'm good, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is a whole, way of just like the laundry, right?
Mm-hmm.
To tackle the laundry. It's like life is like a big pile of dirty laundry. And not only that, but it's like also there's a meteor shower and there might be a big, huge meteor that like hits the house right next door to you. And some of your house gets damaged and you're like, whoa, that was a close one. Good thing I'll never get hit with the meteor. But it's like, we can either do that and say, I'm going to move over there and I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to suffer and make sure my kids aren't going to suffer. And I'm going to do everything I can to live my life to avoid suffering. Yeah. And I think that is one of the most dangerous things that anyone can do is to think that they're not going to have suffering in their life. And actually, and I'm just going to say this one of the things that popped into my head, some of the most together and grounded people that I have ever met in my entire life suffered when they were younger.
Sure.
And they have a different perspective than people who haven't gone through anything yet. So I know that sounds like a really easy thing, but people think of people who had this trauma in their young adulthood or their childhood, like they must be really messed up.
Sure.
And it's like, no, they're not. Like in my experience, they're not messed up. They're like our leaders. Sure.
I mean, I think a lot about the relationship, for instance, between suffering and education. And the stories of people who are educated in some sense through a pedagogy of suffering are, and in this case, by the way, there's the very particular educational institution of the prison. So we have these, Malcolm X, for instance, and many others who write from prisons or experience a kind of education. But it's paradoxical, right? Because if you take it too far in the other direction, you can forget that there's a lot of people who never recover from their education, from the pedagogy of suffering. But I agree with you, though, that there is something formative about suffering that we ignore at our peril and definitely run away from at our peril, right? I mean, the whole meteor shower thing, that really, I think that's definitely true. I think what's cool about your book is that the comedy and the humor is a little bit edgy. It's a little bit dark because it's premised on a very universal human experience of, in this case, very physical suffering. I mean, the reputation, at least, of Gaffigan humor sometimes is typecast as, clean humor or humor that sort of, in some sense, lacks an edge of a kind. Whereas your book, to me, I thought it was edgy, actually. Like and I have to say, it was surprising in a good way to me. I don't know what you think of that, though.
No, I mean, I do think that the Gaffigan comedy is edgy. I think that because it's not, overly sexual, and it's not filled with, the F-bomb constantly. I think that people just go, oh, it's clean.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever hear about, just some of the stuff might be all about how, you might just say, oh, it's, Hot Pockets cause people to have diarrhea. That's the most lowbrow, the dirtiest joke, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I hear some of the material, it's pretty heavy. Like the McDonald's material about how, I don't know if you know the premise of the McDonald's joke, but the McDonald's joke is that when people are you shouldn't eat McDonald's because, it's bad for you, right? And right. Jim is talking about how everyone has their own McDonald's though. So you can judge my McDonald's, but everyone has their own McDonald's.
Sure.
So, it applies to really dark stuff. What's your McDonald's? So it starts off very approachable, and we do see a lot of people in their 40s in the audience that have their 14-year-old because it's safe, and that's a wonderful thing that people can enjoy this. But the dad might get it on a different level than the kid gets it, right?
Sure.
Because I do feel that there's an edge, and I think that there is a little bit of a darkness to the way that everything in the comedy has kind of a I know Jim, so I do know personal Jim, and I know on stage Jim, and so it's very difficult for me not to know the roots of some of these jokes, because Jim takes dark concepts and makes them silly.
Sure.
But that doesn't get rid of the darkness.
Sure.
But at the same time, it helps us cope. So one of the things that I talked about in the book, which is really dark, even though it was all Jim, was the the peg tube that I had to be fed through.
Yeah.
Right? So that's pretty dark. You got a surgery to implant a hose into your stomach, right? And this is the better case. The better case is being on the hose. Because if you're not on the hose, you have the nasal gastric tube, which is it's bad. I don't need to break it down because it's
I'd prefer not to break it down.
So, but the whole thing is that the way that Jim made this horrifying thing to me, made it funny and made it beautiful, and also the universe, the force, was also with us in that too, because who knew that there was an entire community of peg-fed people who never were going to get their swallow back. Right? And all of a sudden they were writing letters thank you for normalizing this experience that I lived.
Wow.
And because so just for people who haven't read the book or know what I'm talking about, for Sam's sake, I'm not going to go into any more physical details about it, but I've already said what it is. So to me, it was all I wanted to do was have food normally. Eat food. I didn't care if it was applesauce, anything. I just wanted to swallow something. But I couldn't because it would go into my lungs. Anyway, sorry, Sam. Trigger warning, Sam.
Thanks.
Talking about swallowing food.
You put the trigger warning at the other side, but it's okay.
Yeah. I'm going to do trigger warnings all the time just in case people need to prevent. Forward. So anyway, long story short, Jim, when I first was trying this method, I'm trying not to be too graphic, but basically you have to mix like a baby formula to put it in a thing to make it go into the stomach. So Jim decided to make it like a cooking show where he was like, shaking the formula like he was like Tom Cruise in the movie Cocktail, and he was lighting a candle to make it more romantic. And if you happen to be visiting that day, you were a guest on the show, and he would say, today on, Feeding Frenzy was the name of the show. He's like, today on Feeding Frenzy, I'm going to peg my wife. Now, I don't know what that means, but apparently it's something really dirty.
Yep.
And so people would come over and he'd say, hey, would you like to peg my wife? It was this thing, right? So, this is still on YouTube, by the way. So when you see this show, I'm like 90 pounds. I'm like a skeleton.
Oh.
And it's like, he is making this amazing, like, way to cope. So he's using his ability to be funny about something that really is not funny at all, right? And at that time, remember, we didn't know if I was going to ever be able to eat like a normal person, right? And there's many, many people who never can. And so I'm always aware of that, just like I'm always aware that I'm privileged in every way in my life. I am privileged. And my experience, if I was like a person of color or if I was a black woman or whatever, could have been completely different when I went to the hospital.
Sure.
But so I'm always aware of that, but I'm saying this is what happened to me. And I want to be really clear with you, Sam, that when I have my miracle story of getting into that brain surgeon's office who doesn't like see patients, like it's not like the head of neurosurgery. I showed my card as a, famous person or whatever. There was absolutely no way. I didn't show an ID. No one knew who I was. I didn't say my name. It was like this kind of miracle story that I describe in the book. But I will never, I did address this in the book, but I'm very aware right now that had I been a different colored skin person, I don't know if I could have just walked into the hospital. So let me I'm very well aware that I'm very, there were things that were working in my favor, right? In all the miracle stories that I say.
Well, I think the edginess and the way in which humor functions in your book is it's actually pretty complex whenever you think about it in terms of, I'm sorry to like hit the gas pedal here theologically, but I think about the cross, right? And there's this idea of like the scandal of the cross in Paul. And usually I think whenever that scandal is invoked, it tends to draw one's mind to kind of a sense of tragedy, the tragic. And the tragic has the absurd. There's a lot of layers to the tragic in literature, in our imaginations. But I always find that I struggle personally with the comic. And I think ultimately, though, comedy has a place. My students are going to love this, and I'm going to make a fool out of myself. But sometimes when I teach, I use biblical references that students don't have to share, because I teach at a secular university at UBC. And so I'll quickly say, oh, don't worry, I'll explain this parable, or I'll explain this story. And I'll give them my 30-second version. And I'm not a comedian by any means. But for whatever reason, the irreverence and the slapdash version and I love at the end of the Gospels when Jesus is kind of just showing up places after he's been resurrected. And I call it the peekaboo Jesus, because on the road to Emmaus, he's like, hi, and then he disappears, and then they run to Jerusalem, and then they're like, we saw Jesus, and Jesus shows up, peekaboo, and everyone's scared, and they're like, he's a ghost. He's like, I'm not a ghost, I'll eat something. Like, I'll do that thing, and my students
laugh hysterically because the ones who know the stories are like, this is not the Bible. This is ridiculous. Like, Sam got basically a few things right, but it's mostly just crazy. And the people who don't know it find it really funny, and they're like, wow, I should read the Bible because it's probably funny. And they're disappointed, of course, when they go and they find out that it's not that funny. What I'm trying to get at is, though, that there is, I think, maybe a place in our understanding of the world, of our understanding of Scripture, of our making sense of our lives, where the comic can intervene within the tragic in a way. And I haven't quite thought about that very much, but you talking about it here and having read the book, so knowing some of the context a bit, that hits me as true, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if you want to talk about the cross and all of this or not.
Well, I mean, I can talk about the cross and all of this, but I don't know in the context of the comedy. But the comedy and the sort of spiritual for me, before this journey even sort of got off the ground, like, because the fear of going into something like this and how quickly I had to process it, in retrospect, was really funny, right? And there were certain moments where it occurred to me in the moment. So, for instance, prior to me going into surgery, and it was actually on Good Friday, so there's something kind of funny about that.
Yeah.
I was scanned for, a lot of times when you have these really, like, these days, like, surgery has all this, like, it looks like you're in like some kind of elaborate computer game. Like, there's so many computers involved in surgery. So one of the things, just like, if you're in a film that has a lot of virtual reality in it, you have to put on like a suit and go in a pod, and there's all these lights, and they take pictures of every inch of your body, so then you can become like the avatar guy or whatever, and that's kind of you, right? So in the same way, they do that to your body and all your organs before you go into surgery. So they literally can render a 3D image of your body that's a virtual Sam, that's a virtual Jeannie. There's Sam's heart, we know it's exactly like your actual body. So that's the way that they are able to, when they're operating, they can like remove all your, vascular system and to see they can just make that disappear. So there it is. It was under that vein or whatever. So it's like, so there is something really funny about that, a really unfunny thing. So in the moment though, when I was in the scan machines, when I was in the MRIs, like that is a terrifying experience. It's just like, especially if you, have any fear of closed spaces or, and then you have to deal with the fact that, if you move, they have to start over and it's really long and you have this thing. And so during those long sessions in there, I could not help but do two things. One was pray, right? But it was like the only thing I can do right now is pray. I can't do anything, right? So that made me very aware that like, if I didn't have that belief that there's a spiritual life, that I would just be in there by myself and it would be like the worst thing ever. It would be nothing. The second thing I had to do was find the humor in the situation. And those two things allowed me to survive moment by moment without going crazy or, having like a panic attack physically. So in retrospect, seeing how spirituality and humor were my tools, and it can't only be unique to me, because I believe that, God wants us to have humor, right? He wants us to be funny. So I feel that even though your humor and your peekaboo Jesus might be different than my experience of the horn honking in my ear, in my good ear. Ironically, I was like, really, the horns in my good ear can't be in my deaf ear? Like, there's something funny about that, even though it's not funny that you're in an MRI and you're going deaf in the ear because there's a huge tumor on your,
Sure.
auditory canal.
Sure.
That's not funny. But in order for me to kind of experience the reality of it, it was so horrible that I had to go there.
No, I mean, I know I'm off. I'm saying the kind of meta thing to the listener now, but I've strayed pretty far from the earliest notes here. But I think, and I'm not saying that you're not saying this explicitly enough, but I think there's something really, really profound that plumbs to a place about the way, at least I've understood Christianity, where, so in Chesterton's orthodoxy, he basically kind of gives his apologia, or his kind of his argument for why he's chosen Christianity. And it's in some sense a triumphalist account of why Christianity, of all the religions, is the religion for him, right? But interestingly, he says there's only one religion, he claims, in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist, which happens on the cross. And this moment in Chesterton, where he's recalling Christ declaring his own isolation, he says only one divinity ever uttered their isolation. It's actually, to me, I always thought of that as saying, like, I don't know, that there was something very profound in a kind of tragic sense of like the death of God and all this stuff. But now you're actually helping me realize that other religions have plenty of tragedies within their myths and stories and tales and wisdom traditions. But I think what stands out about this whole God for an instant seeming to be an atheist is that in some level it's actually kind of funny. Like there's a wit, I think, that Chesterton finds in Christianity. Now, I think whenever we actually go into, like, especially Hebrew scripture and the Old Testament, and we read it alongside other great stories of great floods and stuff, you find out that actually there's a lot to laugh about in origin stories, right? And stuff like that. But, it's not something that literally until this interview, this moment right now speaking with you, that I've quite been able to capture in my mind's eye, despite all the reading and all the kind of homework doing and stuff. So I'm just, I'm a bit stunned, to be honest, by that insight, because if you start with when life gives you pears, I wouldn't have expected to have a deeper appreciation of not only Chesterton, but really kind of like the core wit of religion and religious experience. But that's what you gave me.
But that's also because that's you. Because you know what I'm saying? Like, it wasn't like I planned that. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a really great, wonderful feedback. But like, you're educating me on that. So it's like, that's amazing. Because I think that the irony of the atheist moment on the cross is like, I mean, it's irony is, and wit, it's like those kind of moments that makes things more true, right? It makes things more interesting.
Well, that's the passion.
Yeah.
The comedy of the passion. It's not something, again, that I spend a lot of time and contemplation about. But I tell you what, I'm going to have one heck of a Good Friday this year, thanks to this.
Well, I think that it's also, people are, you have to experience these things for yourself and share them, but be aware that people aren't going to want to hear funny and Good Friday in the same sentence. And I'm telling you, even though you rightly said, Gaffigan comedy is clean or whatever, like, if you even say Jesus or anything like that, even if you are a believer and you think something's funny, you make an observation like this, there are going to be people who are offended. So
Sure.
people
Sure.
who won't even go to the point of like understanding that moment of wit that deepens a moment for you, that makes it more real. And also it's Jesus' humanity, right? In that moment. And what it can teach us about our humanness and our spiritual life when the Son of God himself, right? It's just, there's just so much more. It's so much deeper to go into it. If you look at things as not like, oh, it's so tragic that this happened, that there's this rich, lesson and this rich understanding that we can learn by doing things like that. And so I keep wanting to tell this joke that Jim has, where he is talking about Jesus, and he says, we all know Jesus was a carpenter, but do you think he was a good carpenter? I mean, do you think he was a good carpenter? People were kind of like, well, it's a good thing that Messiah thing worked out because he built a shed for my cousin.
Do you know what's funny about this? Sorry to interrupt your joke, but the church fathers asked these kinds of very ridiculous questions. Like a question was like, did Jesus use the bathroom? Like, did he like actually like poop? Like that was an actual question on the minds of the early church fathers. So again, carry on with the joke, but this joke for me is a very patristic sounding joke. Yeah.
The joke's over, but the point is like those type of things are about us. Right? They're about humans. Humans are like, even with, it's just like, let's say you become like this leading podcast in the world. I'm just like saying, like all of a sudden, Sam, he's the podcast guy. Everyone is in love with his podcast. And then someone's like, he used to be a professor of, they're like, oh, did he have to go that because the professor thing didn't work out? Like, we're always trying to like criticize each other and try to undermine a success and all this stuff. So when people are so literal and they take everything so literally and they're saying this is black and white, the crucifixion is tragic and that's it and that's all you can do, you're missing out on so much. And also you're taking the literal reading. You're not understanding, what can I learn about myself? What can I learn about suffering? What can I learn about comedy? How can I grow in this moment? And so they just hear like, wait, why are you making jokes about Jesus? That's blasphemous. And it's like, no, I'm not making a joke about Jesus. I'm making a joke about myself and about humanity and about, it's like, maybe it was, did you hear Jim started out working in advertising? Well, it's a good thing that comedy thing worked out because he was terrible at advertising. And it's like that he just puts Jesus in it and it just heightens the whole experience because it brings all this other stuff into it too. So absolutely, I think that this kind of like mixing your suffering with humanity and comedy and every emotion. It's like, we can look at every single human tragedy ever, and I guarantee you that someone wrote a joke about it. Maybe not on the first day. But I mean,
no, there's some really good, culturally speaking, I can't even bring myself to publicly repeat the joke that a certain philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, makes about Eastern Europeans in the Balkans and the kinds of humor they use to essentially, they say after tragedy farce, right? He talks about the way he gives specifics, and one of them is like it's really dark. One thing culturally is that quite a few years ago now, I guess maybe 7 or 8 years now ago, there were 43 teachers abducted from a normal school in Mexico in Ayotzinapa, and I was asked by the Philosophy of Education Society to write in Spanish a kind of a statement responding to that because we had been asked by an organization. And to make a long story short, there was something a bit off about the English press reporting about this event, and I couldn't quite tell what it was. So I just went to YouTube to watch kind of TV reporters talk about it. And the first TV reporter I found said in Spanish equivalent, look, we live in Mexico. Bad things are happening like all the time. Like there's something bad happening outside of this station right now. So I know me telling you there's bad news is not a big deal. But guess what? Even for Mexico, what I'm about to tell you, this is even bad for us. And he just breaks out laughing, right? And again, like, it's awkward for someone sitting in Canada or in New York to laugh too hard at that, right? But the moment he hit that note of wit, the details he gave were far richer. And what I realized was that within the Ayotzinapa teachers' tragedy, they resented the way in which the English and the global press said that these teachers were dead. Because even though that they were probably murdered, they had a saying that they were seeds. No sabían que éramos semillas, that we were seeds. And this poetics of the seed and the ground that would grow was laced with a whole entire set of references, biblical, Christian, Catholic, Marxist, secular, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And that's where I found my treasure trove. And that's where I found a more authentic expression of this real human tragedy. But it had to be, in some sense, opened up through a comic, rendition, just to get people's attention practically. But also, I think it kind of relaxed me enough to get into that place of complexity and all those things. So, I think there's deep truth here. I think it's spiritually true. I think it's theologically true. I think it's true for Christians. I also think, though, it gets at something deep in the human condition and deep into our cultural and social ways of life. If we had more time, we could go into even like a cultural critique of where this is missing or stuff like that. But gosh, I'll give you the last word, because I just talked a lot there about Ayotzinapa. But this is what you've done to me. You've just set my mind in 50 different directions.
I don't know, Sam. I think we need to do a part 2.
Cool.
Yeah, I just want to say that, like, I am just sort of beginning this sort of journey into how in all ways that our suffering can inform us to be better at the next time we suffer, right? Mm. And so it was very unbelievable for me that this sort of pandemic thing happening, this little pandemic that we haven't brought up, was like, I was like, oh, okay. So, okay, bring this one on. I remember this. Like, there was something familiar about it, because I was like, oh, wait, so we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to live or die. There's, all this crises going on. And there was something like, I'm suffering. I'm suffering right now. My husband is gone for 3 months. I have literally no idea how I'm going to hold up the family by myself. But there's every person's story of suffering has this redemptive quality to it. And we have to just keep remembering that we can't, even though it's easier for me to say, because here I am doing great. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of time where I didn't think I was going to come out of it. And those were the times that were most valuable for me. And I also realized that I needed to talk about it and discuss it, because if I didn't get out of it, that knowledge would be the fruit of that suffering that someone else could take. So I could go on and on about. Well,
no, you brought us back around to redemption, which is where we started. Thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. I hope it was as meaningful and rich to you as it certainly was for me. I'm gonna have to go for a walk now.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna have to go to my next appointment and suffer.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Folk Phenomenology Season 1, and special thanks to Jeannie Gaffigan. I would like to again thank my sponsors as well. Whippenstock Publishers, Give Us This Day, the Institute for Christian Socialism, Solidarity Hall, Revelation Cable Company, Black Catholic Messenger, Where Peter Is, our special and featured sponsor today, the Juan Diego Network, and also Commonweal Magazine. The friends of the show, who are so important, really, to me, to have friends and to show that this show is not something that appears alone, but is something that arrives with supporters like our sponsors, but also in community like these friends, are the Commonweal Podcast, the Gloria Purvis Show, Disinherited Podcast, Davud Gozli, Up Too Late with Teresa Zoe Williams, Conversation on Tap, Saintly Witnesses, Kinder Conservative, The Show, Gregory B. Sadler, and Kush Classics. Make sure to check out the show notes for links to all of these wonderful friends and also to the wonderful and generous sponsors of Folk Phenomenology. And if you'd like to show your appreciation for this work and for today's episode, you can also drop in something into the tip jar. All tips that I collect during season 1 will be saved to jumpstart the funding of season 2 that I will begin working on just as soon as this season is over. In the immediate present, though, the most important thing that I implore you to do is to just share this episode. Share what you liked. Share what you didn't like. But help us amplifying this show. We're still getting off the ground. Make sure that you're subscribed to the show on your favorite app or platform. If you're using social media, be sure to tag Folk Phenomenology or me personally. And I'll try to make sure to re-amplify those amplifications. Just help us out as much as you can and as much as you'd like. Every little bit really counts. This isn't a big staff for this show, but I count on a great deal of friends, as I've said, and sponsors, and truly I'm counting on you as listeners to get this off the ground, and I thank you in advance for all of your help. Next week, we have another exciting interview to share, this time with Kaya Oakes, a writer, a teacher of writing at UC Berkeley, and an author with a new book coming out this fall titled The Defiant Middle: How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World. We will talk about all those things, including the fact that she was also someone who I reached out to and asked to critically read a pre-publication manuscript of Folk Phenomenology, and she did so and gave me some really astute and truly formative, constructive criticism. And so in this interview, we talk a bit about some of that criticism. We get into some of the technical basics of writing and composition, and also talk a bit about sort of what it means to publish today, in particular to publish and communicate with different kinds of audiences. She supplies, I think, some fantastic, well-placed, but very sharp criticism directed at academic writing or the conventions of academic writing today. All of this and more in next week's interview. Make sure that you don't miss out on that. Folk Phenomenology is written, hosted, recorded, and produced by me, Sam Rocha. You can find more of my work at samrocha.com. Until next week, go out and love the world. Dilexit mundum.
What is interesting to me, really interesting, and I can't define it, is because it's interesting. I can't say exactly what it is, but it's the most interesting, I would say, word, concept, idea.
My job is to somehow make them curious enough or persuade them by hook or crook to get more aware of themselves and where they came from and what they are into and what is already there, and just to bring it out. This is what compels me to compel them, and I will do it by whatever means necessary.
Love is where you find it. It's where you find it. It's where you find it. Love is where you find it. And you don't know where it will carry you. And it is a terrifying thing. Love, it is the only human possibility, but it's terrifying.
Through the eyes of our ears,
We see the beauty of hope. We see the beauty of pain. We see the beauty